Hey, you are now listening to the Graceway Podcast. Let's talk with special guest host Jeff Adams.
Well, hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Adams, and I want to welcome you to Let's Talk. And that's exactly what we do. And this morning, I have the joy to welcome home Pastor Tim Dunn. You've been away these last couple of weeks, blessing some of our ministry partners in far-flung places. And I actually got to sit in that chair for a week, and then back to this chair to interview Pastor Todd last week. But man, it's good to have you home. And one of the things that you did, and I want to mention this because I know a lot of people that watch this little video podcast also watch your message online. And if you haven't, I always say go back and listen to the message first, probably is the best way to do that. But if you were doing that and you saw this thing come up like we'll rejoin our service in a moment, let me explain to you what was going on. And then I'm going to ask you about that, Pastor Tim. You were laying out for us this morning a series of 3 stories about what God is doing in the world and some of the amazing things that God has been doing through this church for many years. But because of the nature of where we work, and sometimes in some of the most difficult and dangerous places, we can't talk about that online because of the security concerns and sensitivity of where we work. But could you just give us the briefest of executive summaries of what you said in the sanitized version?
Yeah, I think, I had said to the church, and I believed it sort of in faith during COVID, but that I felt like God was going to bubble some things up during COVID. And today was a way for us to kind of tell 3 of the stories that he did. One of them is a partnership that we now have with San Lucas Hospital in the Yucatan Peninsula. This nonprofit, self-sustaining, church-based hospital, fully functioning hospital.
You and I both been there. It's amazing.
It's amazing.
It's also one of the better equipped surgical hospitals in the entire country.
Absolutely. And led by an incredible leader, Ricardo Rodriguez, who his dad was a surgeon who is the son of a relationship from the first missionary that this church has ever sent out. Yep. So lots of triangulation there, right? And so not only is the hospital now a ministry of Graceway and vice versa, but Ricardo is our global network director. And Ricardo is, as you know, the absolute perfect leader for what we're trying to do, has a business background, loves the Lord, very cross-cultural kind of dude. Yep. And so introduced the church that way. We also let them know that we have finished our 5th Bible translation and are heading into our 6th, or our 6th heading into our 7th, depending on how you...
Well, actually, we've done 4 so far with the Seed Company.
With Seed,
We had 2 under our belt before we entered into that relationship, which would be 6, so now we're entering into our 7th.
Yeah.
Which is astounding.
Which is amazing. I honestly, before coming to Graceway, had never heard of a church fully funding a Bible translation. And so it took, a lot of interaction between you and I, and a lot of interaction between myself and the Seed Company to kind of get my arms around it. So now just fully committed to this concept of we can fully fund Bible translations, getting the Bible into people's heart language in these difficult areas. And if you're watching and you're not familiar, this is not kind of an overly conceptual thing. We know how many languages are yet to be completed. Yep. We know that we're within striking distance, and technology is accelerating it to such a point that our partner in this Seed Company is talking about being able to get some of God's Word into every language by the end of 2025. Yeah. And so, a lot of theologians think that the completion of the Great Commission is the completion of God's Word into every language. Sure. And so whether it is or it isn't, at the macro level, it's a pretty astounding thing that we're going to be able to be the generation that gets that done. And then the third was just I had spent some time in the Middle East with an incredible leader, and we're doing church planning, discipleship making, working in refugee camps, and starting businesses over there. And by God's grace, the government and where we were is kind of coming alongside some of that.
Yeah, there's just so many things happening that I never dreamed that we would see. Yeah. And I think it's important to point out we're involved in a number of countries. Yeah. in work and ministry that has a tendency to overlap.
It does, yeah.
So thank you for that. And
Yeah.
we could talk about that for a
All
long
day,
time.
absolutely.
But you made a statement after you gave this report,
Yeah.
which you were so overflowing.
Yeah,
It went a little bit
it was.
longer than you thought it would,
It
at least in one of the services, but there's just no way to do that.
Yeah.
But you said this is really, I really see this as being connected to the theme of my message this morning, which was how to enjoy your work.
Yeah.
Unpack that. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that in the States, we over-connect our work to our job. We turn them into the same thing. And I don't think biblically they are. And so I think I was trying to deconstruct a smidge the idea that my work and my vocation can be the same thing. But really, God wants us to have a biblical work theology, work ethic, and that to apply to our job and vocation. But when we kind of re-centralize work as a Christian value and Christian ethic, there's a lot of places that it can go. And so, if I'm an accountant, God can use that work, that skill that I have. He can use it vocationally, but he can also use it missionally in the sense of, some of the places we're working. I had a guy who said to me, I need welders. It's like, wait, you need what? Do you have any welders that you can send to us to train us in how to weld? And we don't typically think about welders being the front lines of missions work. But when you understand a Christian definition of work, any skill set, any work vocational experience that I have is really a tool for God to use if I'll give it to him. However he wants. And what I'm trying to get people to see in this church is God is giving us opportunities missionally that are tied to your vocation or your education, and I want you to connect the two.
Yeah, since I turned the leadership of this place over to you over 4 years ago now, which is
right.
astounding.
It is.
I've been giving my attention to helping people discover their true purpose in life, and because of that, I've become painfully aware that about 75% of the people in this country do not like what they do.
Yeah.
And I feel that's because they really don't understand who God made them to be. And because you and I both love history, and because we've studied theology and whatnot, it used to be in the church in another century, in fact, in the centuries before this, that people would talk about the biblical doctrine of work.
Yes.
And I want you to expound upon something, Pastor Tim, because you talked about this great missional focus,
Right.
but then you talk about how to enjoy your work. And because I know that there's probably people watching us that grew up in church world,
Yeah.
and when you talk about mission, then they connect that in their brain incorrectly.
Yeah.
Well, I need to stop my job so that I can be a spiritual leader and really have meaning.
Exactly.
Now, you and I would disagree with that.
Yeah.
I want you to explain why.
Yeah, I think the only way that I know how to explain it, and I attempted to do it this morning, was your
you
work and your
did.
job don't have to be the same thing, and the reason that people hate their job is because it's not the work that God created them to do, right? But we just can't. We view those so synonymously. So people say, well, I have this job that I have to do, but what I really want, the work I really want to do is. Or you have church leaders saying, if you were really serious about your faith, you would vocationally come and do this work over here. You'd be
Right.
a pastor or a missionary. And none of those principles are in the Bible. In fact, the opposite of those principles
Yes,
is in the Bible.
absolutely.
And we kind of have this idea of like Jesus calling the disciples away from their business, and that's what we need to do. And it, we just are misunderstanding some of the cultural implications there. And, Paul, we even have phrases like they're bivocational, and we thin slice things that the Bible doesn't thin slice.
Right.
And when we do, and then when we overassign value, and then you add greed and capitalism and all those things to it, and it turns into a monster that's really hard to dissect and hard to back out of, I think. And so my hope for today was just to give people a vision for what it could be.
Yeah, you said something a moment ago, and you said this several times in your message, and I think it's important. I want you to expand on this a little bit. You said your work does not equal your job.
Right.
Okay, that I think is profound.
Yeah.
And I think that has the potential to change lives.
Yeah.
Go a little bit deeper. Why do you say that work and job are not the same?
Well, I mean, I think you have to acknowledge that people have physical needs and we have bills, and sometimes I need to do something that might not for a season perfectly align with who God has called me to be. You know, like I remember laying brick, you know, because I felt like I was called to be a pastor.
Yeah, didn't you sell knives or something?
And selling
for a while?
knives, and I ran a marketing department in IT. But I did that job because of what I felt called to be. And I think that sometimes people give up on calling because of their job. And I think that sometimes people think their job is their calling. It gets really messed up. So I think what we really want is people to get to a spot, and you're doing a lot of this work, and I'm trying to do this work in the church, of understanding who God made them to be at a general level and then made them to be at a specific level.
Yeah.
What are you called to do? What are you called to be? And then, yes, there are times where, like I get to do this. I get to get paid for what I feel called to do. But that's not always the case.
Yeah.
But don't give up on it, and don't over-separate it, and don't demonize one and, over-spiritualize the other. God created us holistically, and I think that it's important for people to understand identity and to hang on to the vision that they feel like God has for their life, and not be impatient in that. I know a lot of people who say, I used to want to be a fill in the blank.
Right.
But then I had this happen, or I had to get a job, or I had to, and I would really love to see people kind of more committed to the idea of aligning job and calling if possible, but to not desert calling for the sake of job.
I had to work through that when I retired from being the lead pastor.
Yeah.
Because I had to separate what it was that this church had designated me, called me to be their pastor.
Yeah.
But that was not my identity as a person.
Right. That's right.
It was what I did that was in line with my calling, which was equipping strategic leaders globally for maximum impact in a culturally complex world.
Yeah.
Been doing that for all this time.
Yeah.
So I was able to step aside from my job and still continue my work.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that the same thing would be true with you, Pastor Tim, that God has equipped you with certain qualities and certain burdens that you could do whether or not you were the pastor of Graceway.
Yeah, and I think that it's important for people to understand that was a process for you.
Absolutely.
And not an easy one.
No.
But it's a holy one.
Yeah.
And I think that we get too pragmatic and we're impatient about God aligning things. So we don't want to do the work, and because it's hard, we don't want to stay in that tension. I mean, probably for a year and 18 to 24 months, you and I were talking pretty regularly about you, your identity and this significant change. And I remember how hard you were trying to hear from God.
Yeah.
And that's the point,
Right.
right? That now, there's a clarity and a calm for you around how do the tensions of that work.
Yeah.
And I think that you are willing to do work that sometimes I see other people not willing to do, but then lament the circumstances produced by the lack of willingness to do the work, right?
Yeah.
So because you've walked with God as long as you have, that you don't get to dictate the timeline. You just got to stick in there.
And that's certainly true.
Yeah.
So speaking of timelines, you are talking to some 20-somethings who are seriously thinking about, what do I do with my life?
Right.
What advice would you give to them in the context of this biblical work theology?
Yeah, I think you want that 20-something to have some peripheral vision around their vocation. Meaning, I talk to a lot of students, and why are you going to go get that degree, right? And there's not really a reason. It's just I'm good at math, or I want to make a lot of money, or there's no sense of calling. There's no sense of self-awareness. There's no sense of this is the general field that I can see God leading me into, and I know that if I get this degree, it might not bring me perfect clarity, but it progresses me in that. And so I think you want the opportunity to sit down with a young person with all of these ideas knocking around in their head, all these desires knocking around in their head, and do a lot of the work that you do, which is, who are you?
Yeah.
What has God called you to do? What are your values?
Right.
And based on who you are and what your values are, how do we interpret and filter our experiences and our opportunities and our decisions?
That's good.
And I think that, typically if you can get headed, I think everybody's looking for the right answer, but you typically, in my life, I've always found you have to just head in the right direction.
Yeah.
And God provides clarity at the steps that you need. We want it now. That's not normally how it works. But to get with God around, who am I? Who have you called me to be? What are the values that you've instilled in me? Biblical, philosophic, all of those kind of things. And what's the general direction? And then I'm going to continue to walk with you, continue to have good and godly people around me. I'm going to continue to practice trying to hear from you. And we say walking with God.
Yeah.
So many, many steps.
I always say that life is a series of next steps.
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
not to have this great blueprint laid out
No.
for the next 50 years of life, but
No.
it's taking the right next step.
Yeah.
So somebody else is probably listening to you today because the pandemic has totally, and I think in some ways forever changed our culture.
Agreed.
And especially when it comes to work. People who used to work in an office that are now liking to work at home or whatever. This is one example of many. A lot of people are out of work.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of talk about that. Some people are like, well, I was getting so much money from the government, why would I want to work?
Exactly.
But some people, maybe their job is becoming hard or irrelevant because of shortages. What would you say to somebody who is out of work and hearing you talk about how to enjoy your work today?
Yeah. Yeah, and I would, just for sake of time, I couldn't spend a lot of time on that. But I think, I'm hearing a lot of people questioning, like the value of work.
Yeah.
And
you did mention that.
Yeah. And I'm hearing a lot of people with, different political persuasions who are doing what you said, I'll just stay on unemployment. And I think that we need to just be pretty clear. That is not a Christian response.
Yeah.
The Bible talks about work and working as a God-given blessing and expectation. And especially, Paul uses some pretty violent words to dudes who don't want to work and don't provide for the family. He says they're worse than
An infidel.
An infidel, yeah.
Yeah, you said something that caught my attention today that is not that it was a new thought, but I thought you expressed it powerfully, that God created paradise around work.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
he put man into the garden to steward it and to work.
Yeah, and I've heard theologians go to great lengths to assign work to the fall, but work is cursed, but work existed before the fall.
Yeah.
So God doesn't say, you didn't have to work, but now you do. He says, the work I already gave you is going to be harder. And I think that resonates with us. But I think back to somebody who's not currently employed, that work job paradigm is really important. Just because you don't have a job doesn't mean you shouldn't be working. Mm-hmm. And part of your work when you don't have a job is to find one. Right? Like, how many hours a week am I going to commit to, scouring the job board, pursuing interviews? There is a value in that, and especially as a Christian, I have always found that blessing comes as I work and pursue. I meet a lot of Christians who think, I just prayed, opened my hands with a smile on my face, and waited for God to drop into my hands. Well, I've always found that I had to knock pretty hard on the door.
You said something just a moment ago that I really appreciated, that sometimes you have to take a job to face the realities of life.
Absolutely.
That may not coincide totally with your work.
That's right.
And I think about today, there's so many jobs available.
Yes.
Truck drivers,
Yes.
Desperate necessity for truck drivers, or people in this industry, that industry, crying out job fairs all over. And sometimes you may not like to drive a truck. I'm just using that as one example of many.
Sure.
But maybe you could do that.
We
for
would
a
not
year or
like to
two.
drive
I
a
would
truck.
not like to drive a truck. I would be bad at
I would be too.
have a hard enough time driving a car
Right,
correctly.
right.
But the point is, if you could do that for a year, it might give you the clarity and take the pressure off of paying the bills to
Yes.
focus on, okay, God, who did you make me to be? And seeing the opportunities that were always before you that you never had a chance to look at before.
Yeah, I always say to young guys who are wrestling with their calling, one of the clearest seasons of my life that that I had a desire to be a pastor when I was standing in a mud hole slinging cinder block. And that ended up being a very holy experience and taught me gratitude for a vocation that I was not called to.
Right.
And again, man, we just have this. We are very impatient in general, but it leaks into our spiritual life. I want my dream. I hear people say, I want my dream job out of, like, this is my dream job.
Yeah.
This is the church that I always wanted. If God had given this to me 20 years ago, just hand me a blowtorch and, I would have burned the place to the ground. But I had this concept of myself that I was prepared for something that I wanted.
Yeah.
And God had to do some things, let's say,
Sure.
and teach me some things. But I was always headed in a singular direction.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
what I'm hearing you say is you didn't consider yourself to be too good to stand in mud and sling
did
bricks.
not, no.
That's not the issue. And
No.
some people, God has specifically wired to do that in
Yes.
such a way. You used the illustration this morning of one guy who said he was a bricklayer, somebody
Yeah.
else that said he builds walls,
Yeah,
and somebody else that says, no, I build cathedrals
Yeah.
so that people can worship God.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's finding that place
It is.
for which God has wired us and prepared us.
It is.
And it doesn't mean that a blue-collar guy is any less valuable than a professional.
Absolutely not. And
So-
that's what I said about it taught me gratitude.
Yeah.
Because I think that we all have some snobbery around something.
Oh, yeah, I think so.
And
Yeah, you and I are kind of coffee snobs.
we are. But yeah, I mean, there is a very, very holy thing. I've said to my oldest son repeatedly, he doesn't want this job or that job or this kind of thing. And I always say to him, Bubba, you don't understand the benefit of cleaning somebody else's toilet. You don't
Yeah.
understand the benefit of coming home caked in mud. And
Right.
there are things, in our conversation that a young man doesn't learn any other way.
Right.
And so I worry about that for this generation, that it's all very sanitized, it's all very orderly, it's all very immediate. And add to that our over integration between vocation work and calling, and some of the stuff that I hear people say, it's a pretty slippery slope, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah.
We've got time for one more question,
Okay.
one more issue to delve into. And again, we could talk forever about what I'm going to ask you, but you had talked about this whole paradise and work being the center of that, and how stewardship was such an important part. And you made a statement, and you didn't apologize for it, but you went into it with an appropriate amount of respect, maybe I could put it that
Sure.
way, where this could be construed as a political statement or what, but it's not. It's a biblical statement. And you're discussed with people who have no regard for creation care,
Right.
but yet they claim to be biblical Christians. And it seems like we have so politicized some of these issues that the church in America has put themselves in a corner to where it's almost impossible for them to take strong biblical stances on things that are not politically correct.
Yeah, it really, on certain issues, and I'll use two. One, care for the poor, and two, creation care or environmentalism or whatever, green legislation. We've so aligned with a certain political party that now to disalign on some of these major, especially with economic implications, we would really lose face.
Yeah.
And I think that we know that we would lose face, so rather than losing face, we minimize, I think, some really clear and repeated commands in the Bible. And I think what we fail to understand is that those alignments, those theologies, that Even though they might be compartmentalized in our life, in our mind, they aren't compartmentalized in our beliefs. And so what I was trying to say is a good work ethic understands stewardship of something that's received and development of that. And that's the story of the garden, right? Yeah. God created, gives it to Adam to steward and develop. And so anytime that I think about my job, I'm going into a place that I probably didn't start, and I'm called to develop it, steward and develop it. Well, the easiest application for that in our world is creation care. And I hear Christians talking about, man, I don't care about that, just let it burn, I'm not going to be here. And I watch them do the exact same thing in other areas of their life. Right. This is about me. I don't care what comes next. I don't care what was, and it's the same. It's the same belief system. Yeah. And so, I never want people to be apolitical. I appreciate that people care about politics. I want people of faith and conviction in our political system. That isn't my calling, but I know that it is some people's calling. But I do want, we've talked about this before, do I look at politics through my belief system and theology or vice versa? And I hear a lot more of people who, now that they have come out so strongly politically, they have to, in order to save face, defend the politics even though they can't defend it biblically. Yeah. And that's a dangerous spot for us to get to. That is a dangerous
spot, and I've heard you say this on several occasions, and I greatly respect what you say, that your job as a pastor is not to tell people what to do or how to vote or what party to back, but rather to think biblically.
Yes.
And if you think biblically, you're going to have disagreements with any party.
Every party.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And that's a hard thing to do because we tend to so identify with our passions that pretty soon we're cornered.
We are.
And like you say, to look at something biblically would have to lose face.
Yeah.
We could talk about this for, and totally, not make it home in time for meals and stuff like that. So I hope that those of you who are watching us, I hope that this will give you a little more of the underbelly of what goes into a message like you've heard today and the type of discussion that we ought to be having. And I would just encourage you, we're loving just sitting around talking about what we just experienced together, and that's a great activity for you to do with friends and with family, to be able to just discuss and to learn from each other. So hopefully this little video production that we do each week will be an encouragement to you in that way. And in case you need some more material, we will meet you right back here at the same time next week.
Thanks for tuning into the Graceway Experience. Hope we can talk again sometime.